November 7th, 1944, Eastern France, 23:47 hours. A lieutenant colonel is asleep inside a warm building while 14 black soldiers sit in the rain outside it, eating cold food off metal trays on wet ground. Not by accident, by his order. These men had been in combat 3 weeks ago. They had held positions under artillery fire. They had watched men next to them die. And tonight, the United States Army told them the mess hall had no room for soldiers who looked like them. Inside, hot food, dry tables, white soldiers. Outside, rain, mud, and men who fought the same war. One sergeant decided he had seen enough. He picked up a pen. He wrote a report. And what happened next, nobody in that building, nobody in that entire sector of Eastern France could have predicted. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. Join us as we uncover more stories, historic events, and moments of extraordinary courage from the past. This community is built for people who believe history isn't just dates and battles, it's the story of what human beings are actually made of. His name was Calvin Reeves. He was a tank sergeant, not a general, not a politician, not a man with power or connections or any reason to believe that a report filed through official channels would land anywhere other than a filing cabinet nobody would ever open. He was 31 years old. He had spent 2 years training in the United States while white units shipped out to fight. He had arrived in France 6 weeks before that night. He had been under fire for 3 weeks of those 6. And on November 7, 1944, he sat in the rain with his food getting cold and made a decision that would bring 3 stars to that facility's front gate before midnight. By the time this story is over, a lieutenant colonel will be standing at attention in an improperly fastened collar, while one of the most feared generals in the American military tells him exactly what kind of man he is. And at breakfast the next morning, every soldier at that facility, every single one, will be eating inside at tables in the dry. This is not a story about Patton. This is a story about the man who wrote the report. To understand why that report mattered, you have to understand what the United States Army actually was in November 1944. Not what it claimed to be, what it was. The Army that fought World War II was formally, legally, and structurally segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units. They trained in separate facilities. They slept in separate quarters. They ate in separate dining halls. White officers assigned to black units frequently treated the assignment as a professional punishment because within the institutional culture of the Army, that is exactly what it was considered to be. The regulation was not a loophole. It was not an informal custom. It was written policy with the full legal architecture of the United States military behind it. At the front, this architecture was harder to maintain. Combat did not wait for administrative convenience. Men who needed each other to survive found ways to depend on each other, regardless of what the regulations said about dining arrangements. The shared reality of incoming fire had a way of dissolving certain categories of separation that looked airtight in a headquarters document. But behind the front, in the rest areas, the supply depots, the medical facilities, the mess halls, the architecture reasserted itself completely. White soldiers inside, black soldiers where they could be put. If there was a covered area, white soldiers got it. If there was not enough covered area, the calculation was simple, and it was never made in favor of the men who had been fighting just as long, taken just as many casualties, held just as many positions under fire. In November 1944, the Third Army was pushing through eastern France in conditions that were brutal, even by the standards of a brutal campaign. Rain-cold mud that swallowed vehicles whole. Supply lines stretched past their limits. Men fighting on exhaustion and adrenaline and the particular grim momentum of an army that has been moving forward for months and cannot stop moving forward. The 761st Tank Battalion had arrived in France in October. Their arrival had been fought for not by the Army's institutional machinery, which had no interest in deploying them, but by specific officers who had insisted their combat record and training justified their deployment. They were the first black armored unit to see combat in American military history. They had been training since 1942, 2 years of preparation while the war went on without them. Because the Army was uncertain what to do with a battalion of black tank crews who had trained as well as anyone, and whose deployment would require someone to acknowledge that the architecture of separation had no logical foundation in combat effectiveness. They were finally deployed because the campaign needed tank battalions, and the 761st was available and prepared. 3 weeks after their first combat engagement, they were pulled back to a rest area for 48 hours. They had performed. Their operational record showed it. They had taken casualties. They had held positions. They had done exactly what tank battalions are supposed to do in conditions that test the limit of what men and machines can endure. The rest area was behind the front lines, but close enough that on quiet nights you could still hear distant artillery. It had a mess facility. The mess facility had tables, a kitchen, hot food, and a roof. It also had a lieutenant colonel who had decided on the morning of November 7th that his facility could not accommodate mixed-race dining. He had the regulation on his side. The regulation permitted this. He made the call. 14 men sat outside in the rain. Calvin Reeves had been in the Army long enough to know exactly what was happening, and exactly why it was happening, and exactly how many times it had happened before to other men in other facilities in other sectors. He had sat outside before. He had eaten cold food in the rain before. He had watched through windows before. The institution had been structured to make him feel that this was simply how things were, that the correct response was to absorb it and move on. That reports filed by sergeants about dining arrangements did not go anywhere. But Reeves had heard the story. It had traveled through the 761st, the way important information traveled in the field, person to person quickly, with the specific urgency of something that matters to the people hearing it. A general had relieved an officer for refusing to shake a black soldier's hand. Not officially disciplined, not quietly reassigned, relieved. On the spot. Because contempt for a soldier under his command was in this general's operational area incompatible with continued command. Reeves did not know with certainty that the story was true. He decided it was worth testing. He wrote the report that night. Not a complaint filed in frustration. A formal document. Specific. Precise. The name of the facility. The order that had been issued. The conditions: rain, mud, wet ground, cold food. The duration: 1 hour. The names of the soldiers present. The weather conditions at the time. He wrote it the way a man writes something he believes deserves to exist on the official record. Because if the record doesn't say something happened eventually, it stops having happened at all. He submitted it through the appropriate channels the following morning. He did not know where it would go. He did not know if anyone would read it. He returned to his unit and continued doing the things that tank sergeants do in a combat zone. The report arrived at 3rd Army headquarters 2 days later. Patton read it that evening. His aide later described the reading in an account given to a researcher decades after the war. Patton read the document once. Then he read it again. Then he set it down and sat in a way the aide had learned to recognize the particular stillness of a man processing something that had cleared whatever professional filter usually sorted incoming information and landed somewhere the filter didn't reach. He asked one question. He asked whether the facility was within 3rd Army's operational area. The aide confirmed it was. Patton said to have his vehicle ready. The aide asked if he meant in the morning. Patton said he meant now. It was 22:30 hours. The facility's duty officer described hearing a vehicle at the gate at approximately 0:15. He described going out to investigate. He described looking at the figure stepping out of the vehicle and seeing 3 stars. He said that in 3 years of military service, he had never experienced the specific quality of attention from a superior officer that he would later describe only as the focused presence of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and has arrived to do it. The commanding lieutenant colonel was woken and told that General Patton was at his facility. He dressed in a hurry. An observer noted his collar was not quite right when he came out. Patton did not mention the collar. He said he wanted to walk through the facility. They walked through the mess hall, through the kitchen, through the sleeping quarters, through the outdoor area where 14 hours earlier, 14 soldiers had sat on the ground in the rain with their food trays. The ground was still wet. Patton looked at it. He looked at the distance from that ground to the door of the mess hall. He turned to the lieutenant colonel. What was said comes from 2 sources. The aide's informal account preserved in a 1978 historical footnote and a letter the duty officer wrote to his wife the following week, describing what he had witnessed from near the mess hall entrance. Together, they established this. Patton asked the lieutenant colonel to explain the arrangement. The lieutenant colonel explained the policy. Facility capacity, the Army regulation that permitted racial separation in dining facilities. The practical constraints of the physical layout. Patton listened to all of it. Then he spoke. The aide described his voice as quiet. Not the theatrical quiet of a man managing rage for effect. Actually quiet. The voice of someone who has reduced what they need to say to its essential content and is delivering it without any additional material. He said, "These men are soldiers in my army. They have been in combat. Some of them have been in combat longer than anyone in this building. They came to this facility for rest and food. Your facility gave them rain and the ground." The lieutenant colonel began to respond. Patton said he was not finished. He said, "The regulation you cited permits this. The regulation is wrong. In my operational area, wrong regulations do not operate because they are regulations. They stop operating because I say they stop operating. Do you understand me?" The lieutenant colonel said he understood. Patton said, "Beginning with the next meal served at this facility, every soldier is served inside at tables. The same food. At the same time. In the same conditions. If your dining hall lacks sufficient capacity, you will create capacity. You will add tables. You will add shifts. You will do whatever is required. But you will not put soldiers in the rain because of the color of their skin." He paused. Then he said, "If I receive another report from this facility, you will not be commanding it." He walked back to his vehicle. He was gone before 100 hours. The next meal served at that facility was breakfast. By the accounts of multiple soldiers present, accounts collected by researchers working on the 761st's history in the 1980s and 1990s, the arrangement was different. Tables had been added to the mess hall overnight. The dining was not comfortable in the way that things made right after being made wrong are never immediately comfortable. Several soldiers described an atmosphere of enforced and awkward proximity between men who had been institutionally separated for years. But it was inside, at tables, in the dry. Calvin Reeves was there for that breakfast. He ate inside. When he returned to the 761st that afternoon, he told his sergeant what had happened. The sergeant told others. The story moved through the battalion with the specific velocity of information that matters urgently to the people receiving it. By the time the 761st returned to combat the following week, every man in the battalion knew what had happened at the mess facility. They knew a sergeant had written a report. They knew 3 stars had appeared at midnight. They knew the ground outside the mess hall was still wet when Patton looked at it. And they knew that at breakfast the next morning, they would have been inside. Here is what the administrative record shows. The lieutenant colonel was not relieved. His service record contains no entry indicating disciplinary action. What the record does contain is a routine administrative report filed by the facility's duty officer noting that dining arrangements had been modified to accommodate all personnel without separation. 7 words of bureaucratic language. To describe the end of something that had put soldiers in the rain. 7 words in a document that no one read, filed in a box that sat for decades, found eventually by a researcher looking for something else. Calvin Reeves survived the war. He came home in 1945. He used the GI Bill to attend college. He became a high school history teacher. He taught for 27 years. In the years after his retirement, he gave occasional talks to students about his wartime service. His former students, interviewed for a local history project in the mid-1990s, remembered 2 things consistently. They remembered that he was precise, that he did not soften the war, or the army, or the country that had sent him to fight while treating him as something less than a full member of it. And they remembered that he told the story of the mess hall. Not as a story about Patton, as a story about the report he wrote. He always ended it the same way. He said, "I wrote the report because the report needed to exist, because if the record doesn't say it happened, it didn't happen, and it happened." The 761st Tank Battalion went back into combat the week after their rest period. They fought through November, through December, into the Battle of the Bulge, attached to forces holding the Allied line against the largest German offensive of the Western Campaign. Their operational record through those months is in the Third Army's files. Positions taken, objectives achieved, casualties sustained, and in the offices of commanders across the sector, something had shifted slightly. Not the regulation, not the official policy. The United States Army would remain formally segregated until 1948. The GI Bill would be administered unequally for years after that. The country these men returned to had not resolved what their service should have forced it to resolve. None of that was undone by one midnight visit to one mess facility in eastern France. But 14 men sat in the rain on November 7th. One of them wrote a report that night. 2 days later, a vehicle arrived at a facility at 0:15 hours that nobody was expecting. And at breakfast on November 9, 1944, something that had been wrong stopped being wrong. Because one sergeant decided the record needed to say it happened. In Part 2, the 761st moves into the teeth of the German defensive line, and the army that spent 2 years refusing to let them fight is about to discover what happens when you finally take the leash off. Casualties are mounting, the line is cracking, and a battalion of men who have been told their entire careers that they do not belong here is about to become the reason the line holds. In November 1944, one sergeant wrote a report. 2 days later, General Patton drove through the rain at midnight and told a lieutenant colonel exactly what kind of army he was running in the wrong direction. By breakfast on November 9th, 14 men who had been eating in the mud were sitting at tables inside. The record had been corrected. The wrong had been stopped. But the 761st Tank Battalion still had a war to fight, and the war was about to get considerably worse. By the time the 761st returned to the front lines in the third week of November, the German defensive line in eastern France had solidified into something that American commanders had not fully anticipated. The Wehrmacht was not retreating. It was not collapsing. It was holding. And in the Ardennes region to the north, German planners were finalizing the details of an offensive that would become the largest land battle in American military history. The Allied command did not know this yet. What they knew was that their push through France had slowed, that supply lines were strained past their limits, and that the tank battalions they were feeding into the German defensive positions were taking losses that the replacement pipeline was struggling to cover. The 761st was assigned to the 26th Infantry Division. Their mission was to break through fortified German positions along a line that had already eaten through 2 previous armored attempts. The terrain was bad. The weather was worse. And the division's commanding general, Major General Willard Paul, had inherited a tactical problem with no clean solution and a black tank battalion he had never worked with and had not requested. His first meeting with the 761st's officers was professional and cold, in the way that professional and cold are indistinguishable from contempt when the institutional context makes contempt the default. He reviewed their training record. He reviewed their equipment status. He asked specific technical questions about their Sherman's maintenance condition. He received accurate and detailed answers. He gave them their assignment. He did not shake hands with the senior black officers. He did not need to. He had the regulation on his side. Captain David Williams, one of the 761st's company commanders, later described the briefing to a researcher in the 1980s. He said, "We understood what we were being given. A position that 2 other units had already failed to break. We were being given the job nobody wanted, and we were being watched to see if we'd fail the same way. And if we did that, failure would mean something different for us than it had meant for them." They did not fail. On November 8th, the 761st's first major engagement under General Paul's command produced results that the division's after-action report documented with the specific precision of numbers that do not require editorial comment. They destroyed 8 German machine gun positions, 2 armored vehicles, and advanced the line 1,200 meters in a single afternoon in terrain where the previous unit's best advance had been 200 meters over 3 days. The German positions they broke were not light infantry. They were fortified defensive emplacements that had been constructed to stop exactly the kind of armored assault the 761st executed. General Paul read the after-action report. He read it twice. Then he requested a meeting with the battalion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates. He shook his hand. That is not the story. That is the context for the story. Because while the 761st was breaking German defensive positions in Lorraine, the larger institutional architecture of the United States Army was preparing to make a decision that would either confirm or permanently bury everything the battalion had demonstrated in the field. And the man at the center of that decision was not a general, not a colonel, not anyone with operational authority over the 761st's deployment. He was a captain in the Army's personnel division named Arthur Erickson, 34 years old, former professor of military history at a state university, assigned to headquarters staff as a planning officer. Nobody who mattered paid particular attention to him, which meant he had time to read documents that people who mattered did not read, and to notice things that people who mattered had decided not to notice. What Erickson noticed was a pattern in the 761st's operational data that contradicted the official Army position on black combat effectiveness. The official position formally documented in a 1925 Army War College study that had shaped American military policy for 2 decades held that black soldiers were psychologically unsuited for armored combat, that the particular combination of mechanical aptitude, independent decision-making, and psychological resilience required for tank warfare was, as the document put it, inconsistent with the demonstrated characteristics of the Negro soldier. The 761st's operational record was destroying this argument engagement by engagement, and the Army's institutional machinery was quietly ensuring that the destruction of the argument did not accumulate into anything that required the argument to be officially revised. Erickson began compiling the data, not because he had been asked to, not because it was his assignment, because the numbers existed and the numbers were being ignored, and a man who had spent 8 years teaching military history had a particular sensitivity to the institutional mechanisms by which inconvenient evidence gets filed in boxes that nobody opens. He brought his compiled data to his superior officer, a Colonel Harrison, in the second week of November 1944. He requested 15 minutes. He got 10. Colonel Harrison listened to the presentation. He looked at the numbers. He said, "Captain, are you suggesting that I take this to Army Command as an argument for revising the integration policy?" Erickson said, "I'm suggesting that the operational data from the 761st represents evidence that the existing policy is producing suboptimal combat outcomes." Harrison said, "I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that, and I'm going to suggest you spend less time looking for evidence and more time doing the job you were assigned." Erickson left the office. He went back to his desk. He thought for 48 hours. And then he wrote a memo and sent it not up the chain, but sideways to a logistics officer named Major Francis Blair, who had previously served in a unit that had worked alongside black service troops in North Africa, and who had told Erickson at dinner 3 months earlier that what she had seen in North Africa was not what the official policy said she should have seen. Blair read the memo in one sitting. She was in Erickson's office the next morning. She said, "If we take this to General Lee, we need more than one battalion's data. We need a pattern, and we need it documented by someone whose name is not going to be dismissed." They had 6 days. The Army's quarterly policy review was scheduled for November 28th. After that, the next opportunity to formally challenge the integration policy through institutional channels would not arrive until spring, and by spring, the war's outcome might be decided by forces that made the policy question moot in a different direction entirely. They worked across those 6 days, pulling operational reports from 12 black units across the European theater, supply battalions, engineering units, medical companies, the 761st. They were not looking for heroism. They were looking for the specific measurable outcomes, task completion rates, equipment, maintenance records, efficiency metrics that the Army used to evaluate unit performance, because heroism is subjective and metrics are not. The pattern was unambiguous. Black units performing under combat or near-combat conditions were meeting or exceeding the performance benchmarks of equivalent white units in 9 of 12 measurable categories. In 3 categories, they were outperforming by margins that fell outside normal statistical variation. Erickson formatted the data into a 12-page operational analysis. Blair drafted a cover memorandum. They submitted it to General John C. H. Lee, the commander of the Communications Zone, who had a documented history of supporting black service personnel and who crucially had the institutional authority to place the analysis in front of the Army's Policy Review Board. Lee read it over one evening. The following morning he called both of them into his office. He looked at Erickson. He said, "You understand that submitting this formally means your career in this Army may effectively be over, regardless of how the review board responds." Erickson said, "Yes, sir." Lee said, "And you're submitting it anyway?" Erickson said, "The data exists, sir. If it doesn't go in the record, eventually it stops having existed." Lee was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Leave this with me." On November 26th, 2 days before the quarterly review, Lee placed the operational analysis formally into the Army's policy review process. He did not endorse its conclusions. He did not advocate for integration. He submitted it as relevant operational data for the board's consideration. That framing was deliberate. A general who submitted operational data for review was doing his administrative job. A general who advocated for overturning a 20-year policy was making a political decision that invited consequences. The board received the analysis on the morning of November 27th. They had 1 day to process it before the review session. What happened in that review session is documented in the board's minutes administrative records that sat in archive boxes at the National Personnel Records Center for 30 years before a researcher working on a history of Army desegregation located and processed them in 1978. The board spent 4 hours on the analysis. The discussion was not about the data. The data was not disputed. The discussion was about what acknowledging the data would require the Army to do about the policy that the data contradicted, and whether the operational realities of a war being fought in real time were sufficient grounds to modify a policy that had organizational, political, and social dimensions, extending far beyond the European theater. They did not overturn the policy. The United States Army would remain formally segregated until President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948. But the board produced a recommendation formally entered into the record on November 28, 1944, that black combat units in the European theater be considered for operational assignments without reference to the existing racial classification guidelines when operational necessity required it. 7 words in a policy document. Not justice, not acknowledgement. A bureaucratic opening the width of a crack in a wall through which the operational record of the 761st and a dozen other black units had forced a sliver of institutional light. Calvin Reeves was in combat on November 28th. He did not know about the board's recommendation. He would not learn about it for months. He was driving a tank through mud in eastern France, doing the job he had been doing since October. Doing it the way the operational reports showed, it was being done effectively precisely under conditions that tested the limits of both the men and the machines. But in a headquarters building somewhere behind the lines, a document had just been entered into the official record. And official records, even narrow ones, even inadequate ones, have a way of surviving. They sit in boxes. They get cataloged. They get found by researchers looking for something else. And when they are found, they say, "This happened. This was acknowledged. The numbers existed, and someone made sure the numbers were written down." Erickson was quietly reassigned to a logistics post in England 2 weeks after the submission. His career did not recover. He returned to his university position in 1946 and taught military history for 22 years. His former students remembered that he was precise, that he did not romanticize institutions, and that he told them consistently that the most important act any person in any organization can perform is to make sure that what actually happened gets written down accurately, because the people who benefit from it not being written down accurately are always highly motivated and always organized. Then December came, and with December came the Ardennes. and what the German military had been preparing for 6 weeks while the Allied command was focused on. Lorraine began moving through the frozen forest in the dark, 160,000 soldiers pushing west through a front that was thinner than anyone in Allied command had been willing to admit. The 761st Tank Battalion was 30 miles from the southern edge of what would become the Battle of the Bulge when the German offensive began on December 16th. Within 48 hours, they had been attached to General Patton's Third Army for emergency deployment to the northern front. Within 72 hours, they were moving into contact with German armored units in conditions that would define the battalion's combat legacy for the rest of the war. And somewhere in the files of a German intelligence unit processing captured Allied documents in the Ardennes, an analyst was reading the 761st's operational record for the first time, and writing a report of his own about a black American tank battalion that was performing in ways his command's intelligence assessments had specifically predicted they would not. The report reached the German High Command on December 19th. And what happened next changed the tactical calculations on the southern flank of the Bulge in ways that Allied command would not fully understand until after the war was over. By November 1944, one sergeant's report had pulled Patton out of bed at midnight. The 761st Tank Battalion had broken German defensive lines that 2 previous units couldn't crack, and a personnel captain named Erickson had forced operational data into the Army's policy review that the institution had spent 2 decades trying to ignore. The board didn't overturn segregation, but they cracked the door open, 1 inch, and then December came. On December 16, 1944, 160,000 German soldiers pushed west through the Ardennes forest in the dark, the largest German offensive on the Western Front. The Allied line was thinner than anyone had admitted, and somewhere in captured Allied documents being processed by German intelligence, an analyst had just finished reading the 761st's operational record. His report reached the German High Command on December 19th. What it said about a black American tank battalion performing in ways German intelligence had specifically predicted they would not was about to become the most urgent tactical problem on the southern flank of the Bulge. This was no longer a test. This was the war deciding what it was made of. The German intelligence report was 3 pages. Precise. Clinical. The kind of document written by a man who understands that his commanders do not want to read what he has written, but need to read it anyway. It documented the 761st's engagement record across 6 weeks of combat in Lorraine. It noted their advance rate, their equipment maintenance metrics, their casualty-to-objective ratio. It compared these figures to the performance benchmarks German tactical planners had assigned to equivalent American armored units. In 4 of 6 measured categories, the 761st was performing above those benchmarks. In 2 categories, rate of advance through fortified terrain and time required to neutralize machine gun emplacements, they were performing significantly above. The analyst's conclusion was direct. German defensive planning in the southern Ardennes sector had been calibrated against projected American armored performance. The 761st's actual performance fell outside those projections. Defensive positions designed to stop a standard American tank advance would not stop this battalion at the rate they were moving. The report was on General Hasso von Manteuffel's desk on the morning of December 20th. He read it during a command meeting already dominated by the news that the offensive's northern thrust was stalling at Bastogne. He looked at the map. He looked at the southern flank. He said nothing for 30 seconds. Then, he ordered 2 additional anti-tank battalions repositioned to the sector where the 761st was expected to operate. He was right to be concerned. He was not concerned enough. Between December 16th and December 31st, German armored losses on the southern flank of the Bulge would total 43 vehicles destroyed or disabled. Of that number, actions involving the 761st were credited with or contributed to 17. The battalion was operating at a tempo that the repositioned German anti-tank units had not fully anticipated because the intelligence report had described what the 761st had done in Lorraine. It had not fully captured what the 761st was becoming as a combat unit 6 weeks deeper into the war with crews who had learned each other's rhythms under fire, and commanders who had stopped managing uncertainty and started exploiting it. The Germans adapted. They always adapted. By the third week of December, German forward commanders in the southern sector had begun concentrating anti-tank fire specifically on the 761st's lead elements, attempting to stop the battalion's advance by targeting its command tanks. This was tactically sound. It was also a specific acknowledgement that the 761st had become a priority threat. German units do not concentrate resources on units that are not threatening them. The adaptation cost the 761st. Between December 20th and December 26th, the battalion lost 7 tanks and 18 men. These were not acceptable losses. No losses are acceptable. But they were the losses of a unit that was advancing, not retreating. They were the losses of a unit that the enemy was specifically repositioning assets to stop. They were in the brutal arithmetic of armored warfare, the losses of a unit that was winning. But inside the battalion, in the hours after each engagement in the maintenance areas where mechanics worked through the night to keep damaged tanks operational, a different kind of reckoning was happening. On December 22nd, a Sherman from Baker Company threw a track while moving into a firing position outside the town of Tillet, Belgium. The crew abandoned the vehicle under fire. Sergeant Marcus Webb, the tank commander, was wounded in the withdrawal. He survived. His tank did not. When the after-action report was written, a logistics officer at 3rd Army Headquarters noted that the 761st's operational tempo was producing mechanical stress on their vehicles that exceeded standard maintenance intervals by approximately 40%. The battalion was pushing harder and faster than the equipment was designed to sustain. The logistics officer flagged this to the battalion's supply officer. The supply officer brought it to Lieutenant Colonel Bates. Bates read the report, looked at his operational orders, and made the decision that field commanders in mobile warfare always have to make. He kept moving. Because the alternative, slowing the advance to protect the equipment, was not actually an alternative when the mission was to hold the southern shoulder of the Bulge against a German offensive that was still pushing west. But the mechanical stress was real. And when the after-action reports from those 10 days reached 3rd Army Headquarters, a staff officer named Colonel Charles Lanham, who had been tracking the 761st's operational record since their arrival in France, wrote a note in the margin of one report that would be found by a researcher 34 years later. The note said, "These men have been asked to do more with less for longer than any comparable unit in this sector. The record should say so." The record did not say so. Not officially, not yet. But Lanham's note was in the file. And files survive. December 26, 1944. Tillet, Belgium. 06:15 hours. The town had been in German hands for 9 days. It sat at a road junction that controlled movement through a valley that both sides needed. The Germans had fortified it with 2 companies of infantry, 6 anti-tank guns positioned to cover the 2 main approach roads, and a Panzer IV that had been disabled and repositioned as a fixed defensive emplacement covering the northern entrance. The assignment came down to the 761st's Charlie Company at 0400. Attack at first light. Secure the junction. Hold until infantry support arrives. Standard language for an order that was not standard. The approach roads were zeroed. The anti-tank guns knew exactly where attacking armor would have to be. The Panzer IV at the northern entrance could kill a Sherman at 600 meters. And first light in Belgium on December 26th was gray flat and offered exactly no cover for vehicles moving across open ground toward a fortified position. Captain John Long looked at the map for 20 minutes. He called his tank commanders together. He said, "They expect us on the roads. We're not going to be on the roads." They moved at 0612. Not on the approach roads. Across a frozen field to the northeast of the town that German defensive planning had assessed as impassable for armor. It was nearly impassable. 3 Shermans bogged in the frozen mud in the first 4 minutes. Their crews got them moving again. It took 11 minutes to cross 400 meters of ground that should have taken 3. But they came out of the field at an angle the anti-tank guns had not been positioned to cover. The German defenders at Tillet had 90 seconds between the moment they first saw the 761st's tanks emerging from the field and the moment the first Sherman was inside the minimum engagement distance of the anti-tank guns on the eastern side of the town. 90 seconds to reposition guns that had been sighted for a frontal assault, communicate the change to crews who were not expecting it, and bring fire to bear on targets moving faster than the original defensive plan had assumed. They did not have 90 seconds worth of capacity for all three tasks simultaneously. The first gun opened fire at 0624, wide. The second gun traversed and fired at 0625. The round hit the front slope of Sergeant Calvin Reeves's tank, deflected, and did not penetrate. Reeves kept moving. The third gun never fired. A Sherman from the 1st Platoon put a round through its position at 0625 and 40 seconds. Inside the town it was close. German infantry with Panzerfausts in the buildings flanking the main street. One hit. Sergeant Thomas Harris's tank engine compartment fire immediately. Harris and his crew out in 11 seconds. All 5 survived. The tank did not. But they were inside the town now, and German infantry fighting armor in urban terrain without anti-tank gun support is a losing proposition that the German commanders at Tillet recognized faster than their defensive orders allowed them to act on. By 0712 the junction was secure. The Panzer IV at the northern entrance had been destroyed by coordinated fire from 3 Shermans at 0658. The German garrison had withdrawn north, leaving behind 23 dead, 11 captured, and 6 anti-tank positions that were no longer anti-tank positions. Charlie Company had lost 1 tank to fire, 5 men wounded, none killed in the assault itself. Tillet was secured in 60 minutes. The previous attempt by a different unit on December 23rd had failed after 4 hours of fighting and cost the attacking force 3 tanks and 14 casualties without taking the junction. Captain Long's after-action report was 2 pages. Precise. He described the route selection, the timing, the execution. He noted the 3 tanks that bogged in the field and the time required to recover them. He noted Harris's tank and crew. He noted the German positions and their fields of fire and the angle of approach that had taken them outside those fields of fire. He wrote it the way men write things they want the record to accurately reflect. The report went up the chain. General Paul at the 26th Infantry Division read it. He forwarded it to 3rd Army with a cover note. The cover note contained 1 sentence beyond the standard routing language. It said, "This action reflects the highest standards of armored tactical innovation and should be recognized accordingly." It was the first time Paul had written anything like that about the 761st in any official document. News of Tillet moved through the 26th Division fast. The way news of Reeves's report had moved through the 761st 6 weeks earlier. Person to person, with the specific velocity of information that matters to the people receiving it. By December 28th, 3 other battalion commanders in the division had requested briefings from 761st officers on the Tillet approach, specifically the decision to cross terrain assessed as impassable rather than take the defended roads. The briefings happened in a half-destroyed farmhouse outside Bastogne. Captain Long explained his reasoning to 4 white battalion commanders who had driven through snow to hear it. He said, "They plan for where they think you have to go. You go where they think you can't." One of the commanders, a lieutenant colonel from Arkansas, said nothing during the briefing. He shook Long's hand when it was over. He used the same terrain exploitation approach 10 days later in his own battalion's assault on a fortified position near Houffalize. His after-action report cited the Tillet engagement by name. By the end of January 1945, as the Bulge collapsed and Allied forces pushed back east toward Germany, the 761st had been in continuous combat or immediate reserve for 41 days. Their operational record across that period showed 34 towns and villages secured or contributed to securing 130 enemy vehicles destroyed or disabled, and advance rates that in the terrain and weather conditions of the Ardennes winter exceeded 3rd Army's projected benchmarks for armored units by an average of 23%. The German 5th Panzer Army's after-action analysis recovered after the war noted the 761st specifically. It described their use of non-standard approach routes as a tactical pattern that German defensive planning had failed to adequately account for. It noted that the battalion's performance had required the diversion of anti-tank resources from other sectors of the southern flank, creating vulnerabilities that American infantry had exploited. It used the word unexpected 3 times in 4 paragraphs. The 761st received a Presidential Unit Citation for their actions during the Battle of the Bulge. The citation was approved in 1978, 33 years after the battle. The paperwork had been submitted in 1945 and had spent 3 decades moving through a bureaucratic process that in certain cases moved more slowly for some units than for others. But the citation exists. It is in the record. It says what the 761st did and acknowledges that what they did mattered. It says it in the specific permanent language of official recognition, which is imperfect and late and real. Calvin Reeves was present for the Tillet engagement. He was the tank commander whose front slope took the deflected round at 0625. He did not mention this in any published account. What is known is that he was there, that he kept moving after the hit, that by 0712 he was at the junction. He returned to the United States in 1945. He taught high school history for 27 years. He told his students about the report he wrote. He told them about Tillet sometimes. He told them about the breakfast on November 9th. He told them these were not separate stories. They were the same story told at different scales. He was right. But there is a chapter of this story that almost nobody knows. What happened to the men of the 761st when they came home? What the country that had sent them to hold the line at Bastogne was prepared to offer them when they got back. And what Calvin Reeves did with the last years of his life, that has nothing to do with tanks or generals or mess halls, and everything to do with what it means to make sure the record says what happened. That chapter is part 4. And it is the one that changes what all the others mean. A sergeant wrote a report. A general drove through the rain at midnight. 14 men ate breakfast inside the next morning. A personnel captain forced operational data into a policy review the Army had spent 20 years ignoring. And a tank battalion that had spent 2 years being told it did not belong in combat held the southern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge, broke fortified positions that other units could not break, and took a town in 60 minutes that a previous assault had failed to take in 4 hours. That is what happened between November 1944 and January 1945. But the question that most histories do not answer, the question that changes what all of it means, is what happened after. What happened to the men who fought? What happened to the record they left behind? And what happened to Calvin Reeves, who started all of it with a pen and a piece of paper on a wet night in eastern France? The 761st Tank Battalion crossed into Germany in March 1945. They linked up with Soviet forces near Steyr, Austria on May 5, 1945, 2 days before Germany's formal surrender. They had been in continuous or near-continuous combat for 183 days. They had fought through France, Belgium, and Germany. They had liberated towns, broken defensive lines, and done what tank battalions do when they are used correctly. They had made the enemy's plan not work. Their casualties across that period were 71 killed in action and 296 wounded. Every one of those men had volunteered for a war that their country had structured to tell them they were worth less than the men fighting beside them. Every one of them had trained for 2 years, while white units shipped out, had arrived in France and been handed the assignments nobody else wanted, had eaten outside in the rain, and been told the dining hall had no room. And every one of them had kept doing the job anyway, at a standard that the operational record documented precisely and without ambiguity. When the war in Europe ended, the 761st boarded ships and came home. Calvin Reeves arrived in the United States in September 1945. He was 32 years old. He had a combat record that included 183 days of armored warfare, 1 Presidential Unit Citation that would not be officially issued for 33 more years, a tank that had taken a deflected anti-tank round at Tillet and kept moving, and the memory of a breakfast on November 9, 1944, when he had eaten inside at a table in the dry. He came home to Mississippi. Mississippi in 1945 was not a state that had been changed by what its black veterans had done in Europe. The GI Bill existed. The GI Bill applied technically to all veterans regardless of race. In practice, the administration of the GI Bill in Mississippi and across the South was handled through institutions and processes that systematically directed its benefits away from black veterans. Low-interest home loans were administered by banks that did not lend to black applicants in most neighborhoods. College benefits were administered through a higher education system that was formally segregated and offered black veterans a narrow range of institutions to choose from. Reeves used the GI Bill to attend a college in a city that had slightly more flexibility than his home county. He studied history and education. He became a teacher. He returned to Mississippi and taught high school history at a black school in a county where the white school had more books, more equipment, better facilities, and a budget that reflected the value the state placed on the students inside it. He taught there for 27 years. His former students, interviewed in the mid-1990s by a journalist working on a local history project, described him consistently in two ways. They said he was precise, and they said he never let them believe that what they were being told about themselves by the institution, by the state, by the accumulated weight of a society that had structured itself to tell them they were worth less was accurate. He had the operational record of the 761st Tank Battalion. He knew what the record said, and he made sure his students understood that the record was something real, something permanent, something that said what it said, regardless of what the institution surrounding it chose to do with the information. He told the story of the report every year. Not as a story about Patton, as a story about what happens when one person decides that the record needs to say what happened. He always ended it the same way. He said, "The report existed. The record changed. Everything else followed from that." He died in 1989. He was 76 years old. He did not live to see the 761st Tank Battalion receive its Presidential Unit Citation in 1978, though he was alive for it. He attended the ceremony. A researcher who was present described him as quiet during the official proceedings and precise during the informal conversations afterward, and willing to talk at length about the specific texture of the mud outside the mess hall in eastern France on the night of November 7, 1944. His legacy was not the citation. His legacy was 27 years of students who left his classroom understanding that institutions are not neutral, that records are not automatically accurate, and that the distance between what happened and what the official account says happened is a distance that specific people making specific decisions either close or allow to widen. But the story of the 761st did not end with the men who fought in it. It continued in the Army that had been forced engagement by engagement to confront the gap between its official policy and its operational reality. The data that Captain Erickson had compiled in November 1944, the 12-page operational analysis that General Lee had placed into the policy review process 2 days before the Battle of the Bulge began, did not immediately change anything. The Quarterly Review Board had produced a narrow recommendation, cracked a door 1 inch, and moved on. But the document was in the record, and the 761st's operational data kept accumulating. And the German after-action analysis that described their performance as unexpected kept existing in the captured documents that American intelligence processed after the war. President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, officially desegregating the United States Armed Forces. The order did not cite the 761st. It did not cite Erickson's analysis. It did not cite the November 1944 Policy Review recommendation. Official policy decisions rarely cite the specific accumulated evidence that makes them inevitable. They simply happen when enough evidence has built up in enough places that the cost of maintaining the official position exceeds the cost of changing it. But the evidence was there. The 761st's record was part of it. Erickson's analysis was part of it. 14 men eating breakfast inside on November 9, 1944, in a mess hall that had been reorganized overnight because a general arrived at midnight that was part of it. Small actions at specific moments documented precisely surviving in files and boxes, and margin notes and letters written to wives by duty officers who wanted the record to say what they had seen. The integration of the American military that followed Executive Order 9981 was not immediate and not smooth. The Korean War was fought by a transitioning military. By the time American forces deployed to Korea in 1950, integration was official policy, but institutional resistance was real and documented. It took years of sustained operational pressure that demonstrated reality that integrated units performed to move the institution from policy change to actual practice. The lesson the 761st's record offered across Korea and into Vietnam and into the modern American military was not a lesson about tanks or tactics or terrain exploitation. It was a lesson about what happens when an institution is forced to measure what it has been refusing to measure. The 761st performed. The performance was documented, the documentation survived, and eventually, not immediately, not without resistance, not without 33 years of bureaucratic delay on a unit citation, the record said what it said. There is something worth saying about why institutions resist the evidence they are producing. The Army in 1944 had a 20-year policy based on a study that concluded Black soldiers were psychologically unsuited for armored combat. The study was wrong. The Army knew it was wrong by October 1944 when the 761st's first engagement reports came back. It continued to administer the policy anyway, because the policy was not really about combat effectiveness. It was about a set of social arrangements that the institution had decided to maintain, and the combat effectiveness data was inconvenient to those arrangements. And inconvenient data has a way of getting filed in boxes that nobody opens. What changed the arrangement was not one piece of data. It was the accumulation of data across hundreds of engagements, dozens of units, years of operational reality that kept contradicting the official position. And it was the specific people who made sure that data was written down accurately. Reeves writing the report. Erickson compiling the analysis. Lanham writing a margin note that said the record should reflect what these men had been asked to do. The duty officer at the mess facility filing a routine administrative report that noted in 7 words the change in dining arrangements that Patton's midnight visit had produced. None of these people had authority to change the policy. Each of them had the capacity to make sure the record accurately reflected reality. And accurate records maintained persistently are the mechanism by which institutions are eventually forced to confront the gap between what they say they are and what they actually are. Here is what most people who know the general outline of this story do not know. The 7-word administrative report from the mess facility, the one that noted dining arrangements had been modified to accommodate all personnel, without separation, was filed by the duty officer on November 9, 1944. It was processed through the Third Army's administrative system and forwarded to the European Theater's Records Center. It arrived there in December 1944 at a moment when the Records Center was processing an enormous volume of documentation related to the Battle of the Bulge, and it was filed in a box with several hundred other routine administrative reports from rear area facilities. That box sat in storage at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri, for 31 years. It survived the 1973 fire that destroyed approximately 80% of the Army's personnel records from that period, a fire that cost historians an incalculable amount of primary source material about the soldiers who served in World War II, and that specifically destroyed the service records of millions of veterans who subsequently had difficulty proving their military service when applying for benefits. The box with the mess facility report was in a section of the building the fire did not reach. A researcher working on a history of Third Army logistics found it in 1975. He was not looking for anything related to the 761st. He was looking for supply chain documentation. He found the 7-word report in a folder with 43 other routine administrative reports, read it, recognized what it described, and wrote a note on an index card that he placed in his research files. The note said, "This is the Patton midnight visit. Someone should write this up properly." He did not write it up properly. He finished his logistics history and moved on to other projects. His research files, including the index card, were donated to a university archive after his death in 1991. A graduate student working on a dissertation about black combat units in the European theater found the index card in 2003. She found the original report. She found the 761st's operational records. She found Erickson's analysis in the Third Army's files. She found Lanham's margin note. She found the duty officer's letter to his wife. She assembled the pieces of a story that had existed in boxes and files and archive folders for nearly 60 years, and she wrote it down. Her dissertation was completed in 2005. It was not widely read. Academic dissertations rarely are. But it was in the record. The sources she cited were in the record. And researchers who came after her could find what she had found. Because she had done what researchers do when they are doing their job correctly, she had written down where everything was and what it said and why it mattered. From a tank sergeant with a pen and a piece of paper on a wet night in eastern France, to a presidential unit citation issued 33 years late to a dissertation completed 60 years after the battle, to the story you are hearing now. The distance between what happened and what the record says happened is always the work of specific people who decided the record needed to exist. Calvin Reeves told his students that the most important thing a person could do was make sure that what actually happened got written down accurately. He told them this because he had tested the proposition personally on the night of November 7, 1944, and he had seen what happened when the record said what it needed to say. He was right. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion fought for 183 days in a war being waged by a country that had not decided they were worth full membership in it. They performed at a standard the record documents without ambiguity. They did this not because the institution supported them. The institution spent 2 years refusing to deploy them and 33 years delaying their citation, but because they had decided each of them that the job was worth doing correctly, regardless of what the institution thought of the people doing it. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. The conviction that the work matters even when the institution does not acknowledge the worker. The decision to do it precisely, completely, and without waiting for permission to be excellent. And the understanding that the record, the accurate, specific, persistent record, is the mechanism by which excellence eventually forces acknowledgement even from institutions that have spent decades organizing themselves to withhold it. Sergeant First Class Calvin Reeves wrote a report on November 7, 1944, because he believed the record needed to say what had happened. The record said it. Everything else followed from that. And the war, the whole long, terrible machinery of it, was changed in ways large and small by men who understood that the distance between injustice and its correction is exactly the length of the gap between what happened and what the record says happened. Someone has to close that gap. Someone always has to close that gap. On November 7, 1944, in the rain in eastern France, that someone was a 31-year-old tank sergeant with a pen.